We are today here in the May's last lecture in our PG BOA lectures, lockdown lectures. And today's topic is retinal artery occlusion and telangiectasias. As all of you know, retinal artery occlusion is one of the important and the dire emergencies in ophthalmology. To speak on the same topic, we have a speaker with us, Dr. Sarita Shetty ma'am. Ma'am has done her retina fellowship from Shankar Netralaya in 2006. Also, she has done her ROP fellowship, and also she has done her ICO fellowship from Germany. And ma'am is heading the unit of retina in Lotus Eye Hospital. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you for
I
that.
would like to introduce Dr. Hemang sir. Sir is a senior ophthalmologist and a retina surgeon at Raheja Hospital, and he provides services like anterior segment surgeries, AMD, retinal diseases. Obviously, are his expertise. He specialized in laser treatment and management of retinopathy. He has received special laser training under Dr. Kanti Modi, Dr. Ashok Shroff of Jeslow Hospital, and Dr. Peter Hamilton of Moorfields Eye Hospital, UK, back in 1987. Sir has pioneered the use of slit lamp videography for instantaneous live audio-visual record of the total condition of patient's eye back in those times. Now, of course, we have the latest gadget, but Sir was so inventive in his time that he was one of the first one to start with slit lamp videography. So it's our pleasure to have Dr. Kopikar with us to moderate this session.
Thank you all of you. Sarita, please start.
Can I start? Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Please start.
Yeah, so I'll first start this series by talking about retinal telangiectasia. So broadly, for retinal telangiectasia, I shall be talking about the idiopathic juxtafoveolar retinal telangiectasias and Coats disease. So Gass in 1968 had described and classified IGRTs as a group of retinal vascular anomalies characterized by retinal vessel dilatation and tortuosity, multiple aneurysm formations with varying degrees of vascular leakage and lipid exudate depositions. Now he had classified broadly into three different groups. Group 1, 2, and 3. Again, each group is divided as A and B. Now I'll just give brief summaries about each group. Now group 1A, basically the mean age of onset is seen at 40 years, predominantly in males and usually a unilateral issue. Clinically, you see telangiectasias and aneurysms involving the temporal retina, which is temporal to the fovea, involving two disc diameters. The visual loss is variable depending upon the amount of exudation, and there is no systemic association. Now, group 1B is usually seen in middle-aged, again, males, again, unilateral presentation. It's focal and it is limited to only 2 clock hours of the macula. Now, in this case, the visual acuity is usually 6/9 or better. Exudation and edema may or may not be present. Again, there is no systemic association noted. Now, group 2A, which is now commonly seen, that is the mean age of presentation in this group is middle age. Again, there's no particular sex predilection. It is bilateral and asymmetric presentation. There are multiple stages which are described in this group, which I shall be discussing in the next slide. The visual loss is progressive over the various stages of this group. And this is possible. Group 2B is seen in juvenile patients. Again, it is a bilateral condition, and the clinical picture is usually like a choroidal neovascular membrane. Hence, the visual loss is quite severe in these cases, and there is no systemic association noted. Now, in group 3A, the mean age of onset is middle age. It's usually seen in females, and it is bilateral. There is minimal exudation, and there's quite a bit of capillary occlusion that is noted, which causes severe visual loss. There are quite a bit of systemic factors which are noted with this particular form. Coming to group 3B, Again, it is noted in middle-aged people. There is no particular sex predilection. What we see is, again, exudation and capillary occlusions, which lead to severe visual loss. And we see it's associated with CNS vasculopathies. Now, just describing a little bit about the stages of group 2A. Now, the stage 1 of group 2A is asymptomatic. It is difficult to detect clinically. Usually only abnormal capillaries will be noted on the fundus fluorescein angiogram. Stage 2, again, which is asymptomatic, what will be seen as mildly dilated perifoveolar capillaries with slight graying of the retina and loss of transparency of the perifoveal retina. Stage 3 of group 2A, progressively the visual acuity reduces, and what we'll note is dilated right-angled venules. In stage 4, again, there is progressive reduction in the visual acuity with RP hyperplasia clumped around the right-angled venules. And in stage 5, there is rapid and severe visual loss that is due to intra and subretinal neovascularization, exudation, and hemorrhage. Now, this idiopathic macular telangiectasia has also been now, termed or coined as MACTEL, is proposed by Januzzi et al. In 2006. Now, he's only described 2 types of MACTEL, this type 1 and type 2. Now, type 1 is the aneurysmal telangiectasia, which is equivalent to the group 1A and B of gases classification. And type 2 MACTEL is the perifoveal telangiectasia, which is equivalent to the group 2A of gas classification. Again, type 2 is further divided into non-proliferative stage, where when there is exudative telangiectasia and foveal atrophy noted, and the proliferative stage with the advent of the choroidal neovascular membrane. Now, occlusive telangiectasia was omitted from the classification because of its rarity and presence of capillary non-perfusion rather than macular telangiectasia as a primary abnormality. Now, regarding the pathogenesis, mainly it is noted about only group 2A. Nothing much is known about the other entities. Now, the proposition is that there is chronic venous stasis due to the obstruction of the retinal veins as they cross the retinal arteries on both sides of the horizontal raphe. Now, low-grade nutritional damage, which is induced by specific retinal circulatory disturbances, affects the retinal cells, particularly those at the level of the inner nuclear layer, which also includes the Muller cells, which leads to degeneration and atrophy of these cells and the connecting photoreceptor cells, resulting in the growth of vessels and the migration of RP cells into the retina. Now, abnormalities of glucose tolerance supports the hypothesis of this widespread metabolic disturbances in the retina. Now, the fundus fluorescein angiographic findings is usually what we see as telangiectic vessels, which are straddling these horizontal raphe, and they fill the both superficial and deep juxtafoveolar capillary plexus. You'll also be noting cystic and non-cystic macular edema, which is evident as late intraretinal staining. And in stage where the choroidal neovascularization has developed, you'll see fuzzy late leakage of the choroidal neovascular membrane. Regarding OCD findings, now these are quite important in helping us to diagnose juxtafoveolar telangiectasias. The foveal cysts in the innermost lateral layers are the most common finding in these cases. The internal limiting membrane, which drapes across the foveola, it related to an underlying loss of tissue. Then there are intraretinal hyperreflective lesions, which are the second most common findings. Now they correspond to the visibly hyperpigmented lesions. Then there is disruption of the inner segment and the outer segment photoreceptor junction line. There is loss of the ellipsoid zone. So as you can see in this picture here, the ellipsoid zone is lost completely in the foveal and perifoveal area. There is foveal detachment. There's blunting of the foveal pit. There's foveolar thinning. In the later stages, you will see the choroidal neovascular membrane as reduplication of the RPE. Also, in some cases, you'll see lamellar or full thickness macular hole. In case we are able to do the fundus autofluorescence, we'll see an increased signal strength in the foveal region, which is very suggestive of juxtafoveolar changes. Now, OCT angiography is giving us new information, and which is more detailed regarding the changes in the perifoveolar capillaries, and more studies are being done taking this into account, which helps us to identify and understand the juxtafoveolar telangiectasia pathogenesis in a better way. So this, as you can see, this is one of the fundus picture with OCT imaging. As you can see, and the fundus, we'll get this intraretinal exudation. This is the capillary telangiectasia, which is perifoveal. This is what you see on the FFA. And on the OCT, as you can see, the intraretinal cysts. And these are the hyperreflective lesions. And then these are separation of the photoreceptors in the inner layers. So when the combination of this suggests more of a parafoveal telangiectasia. This is again describes the group 2A. This is stage 1 of group 2A, where you will see on the fundus the nice graying of the perifoveolar retina. If you see keenly, you will see these capillary changes which are occurring around the fovea in both the eyes. It is a bilateral phenomenon. Again, this is one form of the OCT findings where you'll see lamellar holes with the tissue bridging across it. And on the FFA, you'll see the late staining of the perifoveolar telangiectic vessels. Now, the differential diagnosis will include retinal venous occlusive diseases, diabetic retinopathy, radiation retinopathy, Eales disease, carotid artery occlusion. It can be even a subpart of Coates disease, suppose in group 1 patients. In the group 2 patients, the early stages can also simulate a lamellar macular hole, and the late stages can simulate something like a Best disease or focal choroiditis or exudative age-related macular degeneration. The group 3 patients can be simulated in sickle cell retinopathy as well. Now, the management in group 1 and group 3 is mainly observation. In group 1, because usually the visual prognosis is good because of minimal exudation and they do well. Now, and in group 3, because of capillary occlusion, any form of treatment doesn't help to restore vision, and vision rapidly reduces over time. In group 2, nowadays we give intravitreal anti-VEGF injections, which help to reduce the intracystic edema. The intravitreal injections can be either bevacizumab, ranibizumab, or aflibercept. You could also give a trial of intravitreal steroids to reduce the perifoveolar exudation. And in case of development of choroidal neovascular membrane in these conditions, you can give intravitreal anti-VEGF injections along with the photodynamic therapy. Laser in these conditions is not recommended, as laser increases the RPE atrophy and can further cause loss of vision in these patients. Now, coming to the next form of retinal telangiectasia, it is the Coates disease. Now, it is an idiopathic retinal vascular disorder with retinal telangiectasia, with intraretinal and subretinal exudation, without retinal or vitreal traction. It was described by Coates as early as 1908. Now, there is a small variant in this, which is called as Leber's-Millery aneurysms, which are more seen in the macular area. The classic features of Coates disease will include exudative retinal detachment, irregularly dilated telangiectatic vessels, and peripheral non-perfusion areas. There is something what is known as Coates response, that is conditions which are not actually the Coates disease, but whenever you see features of exudative RD and telangiectatic vessels, you can also term it as a Coates response, which is seen in these conditions, and it also form the differential diagnosis for Coates, that is branch retinal vein occlusion, RP, ocular toxoplasmosis, morning glory, retinal macroaneurysms, retinal capillary hemangiomatosis, and familial exudative retinopathies. Now, Coates is usually seen in young females and in young males, and it is diagnosed in the first or the second decade. It is 95% of the times unilateral, it is non-hereditary, and with no systemic anomalies associated with it. The signs could include varying degrees of visual loss, strabismus, xanthochoria, nystagmus, pain. Now, on ocular evaluation, the visual acuity could be variable, as good as 6.6, or could be as bad as PL negative. In the anterior segment, depending upon the stage of the Coates, you can either see a corneal edema, megalocornea, shallow anterior chamber cholesterolosis, NVI, and cataract. These are usually signs of the late stage of Coates. Now, retinal findings are pathognomonic for Coates disease. Now, in this, what you see is the terminology that is given as a light bulb telangiectasia. It's because of the exudation which you see around these dilated vessels. The vessels themselves are fusiform in shape, and they're usually located in the periphery between the equator and the ora serrata. Now, 1/3 of the cases might be even located between the equator and the vascular arcade, but macular telangiectasia is very rare. Usually, the inferior and the temporal quadrants are involved. Now, the peripheral intraretinal exudation gravitates towards the macula, which leads to loss of vision. Now, the dense macular exudate of fibroglial nodule predicts a more poor visual outcome. Now, this is how a typical Coates will look like. So, as you can see, these are the vascular fusiform dilatations, and there is exudation around these vessels, and then gravitation of the exudate is maximum towards the macula. Now, in the later stages, what you'll see is the exudative retinal detachment. In 1/3 of the cases, it will be involving more than 6 clock hours of the retina, and the extent can be more than 6 clock hours in the children who are less than 3 years of age. Long-standing exudative retinal detachments can also show macrocysts, vasoproliferative tumors, and vitreous hemorrhage. Retinal hemorrhage is still rare in this condition. Now, the pathogenesis of Coates is basically there is breakdown of blood-retinal barrier due to changes at the endothelial level of the retinal vasculature. The plasma leaks into the vessel wall, resulting in thickening and sausage-like shaping of the vessels. The presence of abnormal pericysts, which along with the damaged endothelium causes bulging of the vessels and hence a characteristic telangiectasia. The damaged vasculature often rests in a bed of relatively ischemic retina. Now, exudation of lipids from these vessels is responsible for the retinal detachment, retinal thickening, and retinal cyst formation. The foremost differential diagnosis in these children is retinoblastoma. But the features which separate or we can rule out retinoblastoma is in retinoblastoma, you might get a positive family history of tumor, And again, retinoblastoma, as you can see in this picture here, is more of a leukocoria, that is a gray-white whitening, what you see in cases of retinoblastoma in the pupil. Whereas in Coats disease, what you'll get is a xanthochoria, that is a yellow-white pupillary reflex. Also, the B scan in retinoblastoma will show orbital masses with subsequent shadowing, and also randomly distributed dense calcific echoes will be noted in retinoblastoma. Other differential diagnostic features are of retinopathy of prematurity, familial exudative retinopathy, Muiri's disease, hemangioblastoma, toxocariasis, persistent fetal vasculature, choroidal hemangioma, colobomas, and endophthalmitis. The investigations which you'll do in a patient suspected of Coats, the foremost will be the ultrasound, which you might get in high reflective echo of either a focal or a total retinal exudative detachment. The subretinal fluid is acoustically clear in the early stages, but later on the reflectivity might be increased because of the subretinal cholesterolosis. Again, in the advanced stage of Coats, you might see a curvilinear pattern of echo because of the calcium deposition due to the osseous metaplasia of the retinal pigment epithelium. Now in the FFA, what we'll see is hyperfluorescence of the retinal telangiectasia and the venous phase. We'll note areas of capillary dropouts in the periphery. There will be early hypofluorescence in the areas of retinal exudation, followed by late staining and late leakage from the abnormal vessels. There will be associated macular edema, and yes, in the late key stages, we'll also see the neovascularization of the disc. So this is a case of Coats disease. As you can see, this xanthochoria, the pupillary yellow-white reflex. This is a dense exudative retinal detachment. So this is the hyperreflective echoes, which are not as reflective as calcium. They are mediumly reflective. Hence, this is supposed to be more due to the cholesterol, subretinal cholesterol. This is how the fundus picture would look like, fusiform dilatations of the vessels, and this is the subretinal massive exudation. And this is the fundus fluorescent angiographic picture of the same, which will show the neovascularization, the capillary dropouts, and these are the fusiform dilatations of the aneurysms. The OCT will show cystoid macular edema or an epiretinal membrane or vitreomacular traction depending upon the stage of the Coats. CT scan is also done in these patients just to rule out retinoblastoma. So what we might still see some calcified submacular nodules as areas of calcification in advanced cases. The MRI scan helps in differentiating as the exudates appear hyperintense both in T1 and T2, whereas in retinoblastoma, the tumor is hyperintense on T1 but hypointense on T2. Now, this is the classification that is given for Coats disease by Shields. As you can see, stage 1 is only retinal telangiectasia. Stage 2 is telangiectasia with the exudation. In stage 2A, again, it is extrafoveal exudation, and 2B will include foveal exudation. Stage 3 is exudative retinal detachment, A being subtotal. In that, A1 will be extrafoveal and A2 will be foveal exudative retinal detachment, and 3B will be total exudative retinal detachment. Now, stage 4 and stage 5 are the advanced stages of Coats, wherein you will see neovascular glaucoma. The management again will depend upon the stage of the disease. Now, in case there is only telangiectasia with no or only minimal exudation and patient preserving good vision, it's usually observation, and you call the patient for repeated follow-up screening. Now on follow-up, if you see that the exudation has increased, then we can opt for laser photocoagulation. So laser photocoagulation can be done to this peripheral retina in the absence or in the presence of a little shallow retinal detachment. Now, multiple sittings of laser will be required. There has to be a gap of at least 3 months between 2 sittings of laser. And this is how it will look. As you can see, there is extensive exudation which is on the macula, and this is the periphery. Now, this peripheral exudation has been lasered here. So this is the laser marks and the scarring around in the surrounding retina, which has led to a reduction in the size of the macular exudation eventually. But the visual prognosis in this case is not very great because this submacular exudates cause a loss of the RP here. Hence, the vision does not improve greatly. Cryo to these lesions is also another form of treatment, which is usually done in exudative retinal detachments. It is done by the double freeze thaw technique. There can be increased exudation post the cryotherapy. Hence, only 2 quadrants are done in one sitting, and there is a gap of 4 weeks between any 2 sittings. And the same area is only treated after 3 months of cryo. Again, this is to reduce the possible exudation after the cryotherapy. So this is an example. As you can see in this fundus photo, you can see submacular exudation, and the same picture of the FFA, you will see capillary dropouts, telangiectatic vessels in the periphery, again prominently seen in this picture here, the capillary non-perfusion area and the telangiectasia. As you can see, this is post-cryo. There is scarring of the peripheral retina, which leads to subsequently reduction in the macular exudation, which will help to improve the vision. Now, anti-VEGFs and intravitreal steroids are only adjuvants in treating Coats disease. They help in resolution of the macular edema and exudation. Now, as the VEGF levels are not involved in the pathogenesis of Coats, hence they don't help in stalling the exudative process. Now, vitreoretinal surgery can be taken up in very severe stage 3 exudative retinal detachment in case you're sure of the patient gaining some amount of vision, especially maybe if the patient has one eye. Observation, usually if you see the patient in the last advanced stage where you leave the eye to go into phthisis, and enucleation will be required in cases of painful blind eye. Now, this is just a chart giving the preferred treatment modalities based on the disease stage. So, as I said, stage 1 and 2 is what you'll do laser photocoagulation with cryotherapy. In stage 3, in addition, you can do external drainage of the retinal detachment. In stage 4, there can be a trial of external drainage of the retinal detachment or vitreoretinal surgery. Glaucoma surgery can be thought of in case of neovascular glaucoma, in case you do salvage the eye. In the advanced end-stage disease, if the patient is asymptomatic, it is usually observation. And if the patient has painful blind eye, then it is better to enucleate the eye. The factors predictive of poor vision in Coats is retinal telangiectasia involving the superior quadrant, diffuse or post-equatorial zonal involvement, failure of the exudation to resolve after the treatment, and presence of retinal macrosis. So these factors predict poor visual outcome in Coats disease. So in case anyone is feeling a little sleepy, can we take a break or should I go ahead?
You can go ahead, ma'am.
Can I go ahead with the next topic will be retinal arterial obstruction.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
You have to close this presentation and open the other one. Yeah.
Is this fine?
Yes, ma'am. We can see that.
Has Dr. Nishikant Borse joined in?
Yes,
I
ma'am.
had requested him to because
He's here only. Just a minute.
yeah, that's great. Because obviously he's doing good vitrectomy surgeries in CRAO, good visual outcomes.
Good evening, Nishikant sir.
Evening, good evening.
Good
How are
evening,
you all?
sir.
Good evening.
So sorry to keep you waiting. I'll just start this. So at the end, we can have you to talk about your outcomes of vitrectomies for post-CRAO, sir.
Sure, sure.
Thank you, sir. So again, retinal arterial obstructive disease is further classified into 5 types, which include central retinal artery obstruction, branch retinal artery obstruction, senoretinal artery obstruction, combined central retinal artery and vein obstruction, and cotton wool spots. So first, starting with central retinal artery obstruction, I will just give a brief introduction about the anatomy. So as we all know, the central retinal artery is the last branch of the ophthalmic artery, which is the first branch of the carotid artery. And the central retinal artery further bifurcates into superior and inferior branches, which further bifurcate into temporal and nasal branches. Now these supply the inner layers of the retina, the inner half of the retina. The outer layers are supplied by the ciliocoroidal capillaries, which are formed by the posterior ciliary artery. Now, in 50% of the patients, we also note the cilioretinal artery, which is formed from the posterior ciliary artery, and it supplies the papillomacular bundle in varying degrees. Now, Son Singh Hari has classified CRAO as non-arthritic permanent CRAO, non-arthritic permanent CRAO with cilioretinal artery sparing, transient non-arthritic CRAO, and arthritic CRAO. Now, non-arthritic permanent CRAO usually represents 2/3 of the cases of CRAO. It is caused by the atherosclerotic disease, wherein you have, it can be either in the form of a platelet fibrin thrombi or an emboli. It's a permanent CRAO with retinal infarction and cherry red spot, and retinal arterial changes that are seen. Retinal infarction, obviously due to the loss of the blood flow, what you will see is whitening, which is specifically seen at the posterior pole due to stoppage of the azoplasmic flow. And the cherry red spot, which is seen due to attenuation of the foveolar reflex, and the retinal arterial changes in the form of attenuation of the retinal arterioles. There will be no evidence of giant cell arthritis in this case. The risk factors for non-arthritic permanent CRAO will include hypertension, diabetes mellitus, carotid or coronary artery disease, transient ischemic attacks, or cerebral vascular accidents, smoking. In young patients, it could be hemoglobinopathies, which include hyperhomocystinemia, various antiphospholipid antibody mutations, sickle cell diseases. The other ocular risk factors will include raised intraocular pressure, optic nerve head drusen, and presence of pre-retinal arterial loops. Now, non-arthritic transient CRAOs comprise 15 to 17% of CRAOs. They have the best visual prognosis, as the name suggests, they are like transient ischemic attacks of the central retinal artery occlusion. The restoration of the blood flow results in resolution of the symptoms. It is usually due to transient vasospasm due to the serotonin release from the platelets on the atherosclerotic plaques. Now coming to the non-arthritic CRAO with ciliaretinal sparing. Now what we normally see is whitening of the peripheral retina. The central retina along the papillomacular bundle is perfused to varying degrees depending upon the distribution of the ciliaretinal artery. So as you can see in this picture, the distribution is larger and the visual prognosis is much better in these patients. Here, where the ciliaretinal sparing is very minimal and does not involve the fovea, here the visual prognosis is poor. The arthritic CRAO, the cause is obviously giant cell arthritis. It is again a permanent CRAO, and in these cases you see a optic disc edema due to the associated arthritic anterior ischemic optic neuropathy. Now, in clinical evaluation, history is very important. You'll have to rule out atherosclerotic risk factors, which we just noted in the family, to ask history of the patient regarding systemic risk factors. The patient might also give history about transient blurring of vision, suggestive of transient ischemic attacks in the eye, or in history of cerebral stroke or myocardial infarction. In younger patients, you have to rule out vasculitis by examining the other eye as well, or any other systemic associations for hypocoagulable states, or in females for the consumption of oral contraceptive pills. Now, as we all know, central retinal artery obstruction is an ocular emergency wherein there is acute blockage of blood flow within the central retinal artery. It's usually seen in people beyond 60 years of age, in males more than females. It's usually unilateral. In 1 or 2% cases where it is bilateral, you have to suspect cardiac valvular disease, giant cell arthritis, and vascular inflammations. The clinical features will include sudden unilateral painless visual loss, usually waking up in the morning. They'll give history of amaurosis fugax. Visual acuity will be usually counting fingers of PL. In case there is presence of rubeosis iridis, we have to rule out carotid artery obstruction in these patients. Afferent pupillary defect will be very obvious in CRAO patients. The other eye also should be examined for diabetic or hypertensive retinopathy and to look for optic disc drusen or preretinal capillary loops. The fundus picture in CRAO patients can be divided into two as acute and late. Acute, which we see in within hours, will be the yellow whitening of the superficial retina at the posterior pole, the cherry red spot, the edema, pale edema at the optic disc, and cattle trucking appearance of the arterioles. In the late phase, that is beyond 4 to 6 weeks, what will be noted is a pale optic disc, attenuated retinal vasculature, visible absence of the nerve fiber layer in the affected part of the optic disc, box scarring or segmentation of the blood column in the arteries and the veins, cilioretinal collaterals, and macular RP changes. So the intraretinal emboli, which are seen as these plaques, can be further divided into either cholesterol, calcific, and fibrinoplatelet. So cholesterol emboli are the Holonos plaques, which are small, yellow, and refractile. The calcific emboli are usually single, white, and non-scintillating. And fibrinolytic platelet emboli will be noted as small, pale bodies within the arterioles. The ocular investigations, which will include the fundus fluorescein angiogram. The FFA will show normal choroidal filling with increased arm retina time, which will be beyond 11 seconds. There will be a delay in the AV transit time. It's a late staining of the optic disc, is reduced caliber of the retinal vasculature, and there's cattle trucking of the blood column. As this is what we can see very clearly as a cattle trucking of the blood column. The OCT will show diffuse thickening of the neurosensory retina and increased reflectivity from the inner retinal layers and decreased backscattering of the photoreceptors. The OCT is usually not advised because it is of no prognostic significance. Visual fields usually can be only picked up on Goldman perimeter is the remaining temporal islands, or in cases of cerebroretinal artery sparing, you might pick up a small central island. ERG for CRAO will show a normal E wave and a decreased amplitude of the B wave. Physical evaluation is very important in CRAO patients. You have to look out, get the pulse rate, check the blood pressure, to look for scalp tenderness and nodular temporal arteries to rule out giant cell arteritis. And you have to look at other signs of autoimmune connective disorders like joint swellings and tenderness. The CRAO workup will include ESR, CRP, and platelets to exclude the arthritic causes. The other common vascular causes that have to be ruled out is increased blood sugar and lipid profiles. To investigate for the embolic sources, you need to do a duplex carotid ultrasound and an echocardiogram of the heart. In young patients less than 50 years of age with no other vascular risk factors, we'll have to rule out hypocoagulable states by screening them for protein CNS factor 5 laden antiphospholipid antibodies. The other vasculitic screening will include ANA, ANCA, and AC. And we also need to rule out myeloproliferative sickle cell disease in these patients. So, CRAO being an ocular emergency, it has to be managed within the first 6 hours. Now, irreversible damage is noted in the retinal layers within 240 minutes of stopping of the vascular perfusion. So, the ocular management will include ocular massage and anterior chamber paracentesis, which can be done on the OPD basis. The others which will require the physician will be sublingual isosorbate dinitrate, IV acetazolamide or IV mannitol with alprednisolone, streptokinase, anticoagulants, again thrombolytics. So all this will have to be done under the care of a cardiologist. The role of hyperbaric oxygen in restoring the central retinal artery flow is questionable. There will also be reports of transluminal Nd:YAG laser embolysis of the emboli which are noted in the central retinal artery. You can have no personal experience about how beneficial these are. Coming to the vitrectomy, yeah, some of our seniors and colleagues are doing vitrectomy, wherein the embolus of the central retinal artery is pushed towards the periphery, thereby restoring the ocular blood flow. Dr. Borsi will be talking about it later on. Coming to the long-term management, we have to prevent ocular neovascularization and glaucoma in these patients, though rare. Hence, they have to be followed up after 2 weeks, and then again monthly for the next 4 months at least, to rule out formation of neovascular glaucoma. Main management will include to look out for the systemic atherosclerotic risk factors and treat them accordingly. Coming to the branch retinal artery obstruction, it is caused due to acute blockage of the blood flow within the branch retinal arteries. It is seen in more than 65 years age group. 99% of the time it is unilateral. The pathophysiology is again similar to the non-arthritic CRU. Clinical features will include acute painless unilateral visual loss, visual field loss. 10% will give history of transient ischemic attacks. The afferent pupillary defect will depend on the distribution of the obstruction of the branched retinal artery obstruction. There will be localized retinal whitening limited to the distribution of the obstructed arteriole. 90% of the times the temporal retinal arteries are involved. You might also see the presence of retinal intraarterial plaques, either cholesterol or calcific or fibrin platelets. The differential diagnosis will include retinitis, which is secondary to toxoplasma and CMV. They can be differentiated as in retinitis. You'll also see presence of retinal hemorrhages and vitreous cells. So this is the FFA picture where you'll see delayed or no filling of the occluded branch. You can also see the plaque here. There will be hyperfluorescence due to lack of perfusion and blockage here by the edema. There is retrograde filling happens in the distal veins. The prognosis in BRAO is usually good if the fovea is not involved. 80% of the cases will have better than 6/12 vision, though the visual field defects will remain permanent. The serioretinal artery occlusion again is acute blockage of blood flow within the serioretinal artery, seen in people more than 65 years of age. 99% of the time it is unilateral. Again, the causes, the risk factors are same as the non-arthritic central retinal artery occlusion. Patients present with acute unilateral painless visual field loss in the center. 10% of the times they give history of transient ischemic attacks. Again, afferent pupillary defect depends upon the area of distribution of the obstruction. Now, you can have either an isolated serioretinal artery occlusion, where you see this pale retina. Visual prognosis is good since it's non-involving the fovea, and it's seen in 40% of the eyes, and 95% of the times they improve to more than 6/12. Now, you can also have senoretinal artery obstruction with CRVO. So this happens in 40% of the cases of serioretinal artery obstruction. The CRVO is usually the non-ischemic type. So what you see on the fundus is, you'll see the pale whitening of the posterior pole at the papillomacular bundle. This is due to the serioretinal artery obstruction. Plus, you will see the dilatation of the retinal venules and also dot and blot hemorrhages in the retina. Now, 70% of the time, the vision will be better than 6/12. It happens due to low hydrostatic pressure in the serioretinal artery as compared to the central retinal artery. You'll also note associated optic disc swelling. The third type of serioretinal artery obstruction is that with AION, that is anterior ischemic optic neuropathy. In these cases, the visual prognosis is usually poor, either 3/62 NPL. You see at hyperemic optic nerve head swelling due to non-arthritic posterior ciliary insufficiency. Pale optic nerve head swelling is suggestive of giant cell arteritis. So it depends. The optic nerve head swelling will give you an idea whether it is due to non-arthritic or arthritic. So in case it is hyperemic swelling, it will be non-arthritic etiology. And if it is a pale swelling, then it is a giant cell arteritis. Again, differential diagnosis would be retinitis secondary to toxo or CMV. Can be differentiated with the presence of hemorrhages in which cells. FFA will show non-perfusion of this dye limited to the serioretinal artery throughout the AV phase. Again, systemic workup is very important in these patients. There's hardly any ocular treatment that you can do. Coming to the entity of combined central retinal artery and vein obstruction. It's usually seen in retrobulbar injections in 1/4 of the cases. The clinical features will include both of CRAO and CRVO. Patients will present with sudden onset of painless loss of vision. So as you can see here, there is disc swelling, this completely pale retina, plus there is multiple dot and blotch ridges all over the retina with vasodilatation. So I suggest this is what we just spoke about. The FFA in combined central retinal artery and vein obstruction, this shows severe retinal capillary non-perfusion, sudden termination of the mid-sized terminal vessels, and minimal leakage and shutdown of the retinal vessels. The visual prognosis in these cases again is very poor. 80% of them will develop neovascular glaucoma over 6 weeks. Aggressive panretinal photocoagulation is required to prevent neovascularization, but that again does not help to improve vision. Coming to the last part of retinal artery obstructions is the cotton wool spots, which are also called as the soft exudates. Now these are yellow-white lesions in the superficial retina with feathery margins. They're usually less than 1/4 this diameter in size. Now, these are areas of retinal capillary non-perfusion bordered by microaneurysmal abnormalities. They develop secondary to the retinal arterial obstruction, which leads to hypoxia and further blockage of exoplasmic transport within the nerve fiber layer, leading to deposition of the intra-axonal organelles like mitochondria and lipids. Now, 95% of the time it is associated with systemic diseases like diabetes and hypertension. Again, cotton wool spots are one of the pathognomonic features of HIV. Patient will complain of seeing spots in the visual field. They usually resolve in 5 to 7 weeks, but they take longer in diabetics. And systemic workup is very important in these patients to rule out systemic causes. This is the fundus picture, how you'll see. So these are the cotton wool spots. You will see a few microaneurysms scattered here and there. These usually resolve. The FFA will show these areas of infarction, which is again more prominent in the foveolar area. So I hope I have not induced sleep. My presentation ends here. Any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Sarita.
Thank you, sir.
There was one question.
Yes, sir.
One of the doctors wanted to know what is the difference between juxtafoveal telangiectasia and diabetic retinopathy, and whether FFA is a must in all these cases. So I think they missed some of the probably what you had said, but if you can just recapitulate what is the difference between diabetic retinopathy or diabetic maculopathy specifically and idiopathic telangiectasia.
Yeah, so as we all know, a diabetic maculopathy specifically will show microaneurysms, which will be absent in juxtafoveal telangiectasia. You know, the patient will give history of diabetes. But like I said, microaneurysms is what will differentiate. Plus, the OCD findings, which I had just shown. Should I go back to those slides?
If you can go back to it, if you can access it, well and good.
Just a minute. Yeah. So as you can see, now like how.
Sarita, you have to stop share your initial PPT.
Oh, sorry. Does it come?
Yeah, now it is clear.
Yeah, now it has come. Now it's
Yeah. So as you can see here, so you see these fusiform dilatations of the aneurysms with the exudation. Now, I agree this is very similar to the diabetes, but in diabetes it's usually bilateral. You see this in unilateral cases. Again, what is more pathognomonic is their loss of the ellipsoid zone here in the OCT, which you can see in juxtafoveal telangiectasia, plus these backscattering of the hard exudates and these loss of the photoreceptors. So FFA definitely helps to differentiate diabetic maculopathy from juxtafoveal telangiectasia.
So
Okay,
we
now-
have presentations from yourself, Hemang sir also and Borse sir also. Should we quickly move on to those and then take up the questions? Both of you have some slides to show.
Yeah, let Dr. Borse show first. Yeah.
So
Okay.
I'll stop share. Huh? Yeah.
All right. So you all want me to present the vitrectomy things?
Yes, sir, please. So, Dr. Borse does these vitrectomies for central retinal artery occlusion patients, and he's got good visual, good results post-op. So that's why we had requested him to share his experience
so
with us. Yes,
I'll
please.
just go through this quite quickly. So basically, when we talk about vitrectomy, we are basically talking, like you classified, we are talking about the non-arthritic CRO,
Yes, sir.
not at all about the transient or the arthritic ones. Okay. So for treatment of CRO, what are the options we have? We have either the paracentesis or IOP reduction or massage. These are the traditional methods that are there, which should help in resolution of the CRO if it resolves good enough. But if there is no resolution of the CRO, then the CRO would go on to the natural history, which is usually permanent visual loss and a mild recovery of vision. And that's where we should try to intervene and have a better outcome of vision rather than let it go to the natural history as it is. Now, what are the possible interventions that we have? Number one is a medical thrombolysis or a surgical vitrectomy. Now, like you said, most of the emboli are not thrombi. They are basically cholesterol, fibrin, and calcific. And therefore, a thrombolysis may not really help much. And there were no benefits seen in the EAGLE study in which they actually injected TPA into the carotid to resolve the CRO. So what we do the surgical vitrectomy then, it gives us a triple advantage. One, it induces a hypertony, which we also do by paracentesis. It helps us to directly massage the central retinal artery and the disc dissection, helping in dislodging the embolus. Let us see the procedures. Now, this is how an hypertony works. You can see this is the case of CRO. After doing paracentesis, you can see the perfusion come up very well. But the minute the IOP goes back to normal, the perfusion goes down. So imagine if you have a hypertony for a very, very long time, like in a vitrectomy, if you do with only 8 millimeters of mercury, it will give you a very prolonged hypertony, which will be intraoperative as well as post-operative. So, that will be a good thing to have. Secondly, it helps us to massage the central retinal artery directly and helps us to dislodge the embolus which will be there. And in case we can actually see a embolus or a large thrombus, we can even nick the area of central retinal artery and we can take out the embolus. It pops out very nicely. So for this dissection, actually what we do is we stay in the internal limiting membrane and then we slowly dissect it towards the center of the disc. It helps us to de-roof the disc. This is the area of de-roofing, and helps us to open up this compartment where the central retinal artery comes up and helps us to move the embolus forward. And these are the photographs where you can see preoperatively of central retinal artery occlusion. You can see there is no perfusion here and there is no thrombus here, but this is a thrombus that has come in post-operatively. So let us see a few of these cases. This was a young person who had come with a CRO. And here you can see I'm doing the disc dissection and the massage. And there's a part of the embolus which is moved up. And then you can start seeing pulsation of the central retinal artery coming up. And I continue with the massage, and you can see the part of the other part of the occluding thrombus going off. This is embolus going off. This is a case where there was a mitral valve surgery, and after that you can see there's a very large plaque intraarterial, and it is actually has to be literally massaged by the vitrectomy probe itself to move it to the periphery. And you can see how sluggishly it is moving because the perfusion is still not completely restored. So you come back and then you dislodge the rest of the thrombus, and you can see how fast it is moving off. And these are the post-operative pictures. In the very first post-operative day, the patient recovers pretty good. This is another case in which you can see there's a dislodgement, and it is nicely moving away from the center to the periphery in the blood vessel, and the perfusion is restored. So does this work in branch retinal artery occlusions also? So it does. Here I am doing a disc massage in a case of a branch retinal artery occlusion. And you can see as the massage continues, you can see the embolus is moving away from the center to the periphery. And this patient did exceptionally well. You can see this is the ischemic area, and this is the hyperechoic part that you see in OCT, which is pathognomonic of central retinal artery or arterial occlusion. And he did extremely well. Some of the cases I'm showing now, which have been done by my colleagues in Mumbai. This is a fantastic video of Dr. Somil Seth, who did it in a one-eyed patient. You can see so nicely the embolus moving away, and this embolus was a large embolus which actually broke into multiple pieces. And as he goes on with the surgery, you can see multiple parts of that embolus moving away and causing the perfusion to be restored. There's a similar video by Dr. Vikram Mehta, who's done a vitrectomy, and here you can see he's nudging the embolus away from the center. And you can see successfully it is dislodged. So these surgeries do work in a certain section of cases. This is the evidence of reperfusion. This was one patient which perception of light. You can see in FFA, very late, some amount of perfusion coming in, but initially no perfusion at all, which is very typical of a central retinal artery occlusion. And post-operatively, this one patient got 20/20 vision, and you can see in FFA as early as 28 seconds, complete perfusion is restored, and this is post-operatively. So till today, I've done about 36 eyes, and about 33% of them have got more than 6/60 vision, which I feel is pretty good to restore in cases of CRAO, which otherwise we can consider most of the time that as a lost eye. They are just the graphs, let's not go through that. Now, many times people have asked me whether it may have been a natural history, but if you go through the literature, you can see the biggest collection is by Dr. Here et al. And he said that 22% of CRAOs have a visual improvement, but it is mainly an eccentric or a peripheral visual improvement, and in not a central visual improvement. And in our retrospective analysis, more than 33% had a central visual improvement, whereas the vision had improved more than 6/60. Now, is embolus dislodgement to be seen necessary for visual improvement? Not necessary. Sometimes your perfusion pressure is so fast that you may not see the embolus at all, and it might just get dislodged as a very small one going to the periphery. Now, what is the limitation of this procedure? The limitation of the procedure is if the CRAO is here, where the central retinal artery pierces the dura. If this is the site of occlusion, then whatever we do here is not going to work. This surgery only works if the occlusion is near the lamina cribrosa area. And of course, it will not work well if the duration is very long, more than 3 to 4 days, then most of the retinal cells are dead. Now, what is the future that is going to come? We need to have a better visualization. We need to have a better visualization of the embolus, which I was lucky in one of the cases which would actually see, but otherwise it's very difficult to get visualization. And if we get a better visualization and we can visualize whatever amount of residual blood flow is there, then we can know whether to intervene or not. So if you see in a central retinal artery occlusion, the survival of the retinal cells is dependent upon the residual blood flow which is going on and the length of the time that it can withstand that. So if there is a residual blood flow is present in the eyes, then we have some chance of visual improvement, and therefore we have to have futures in future the method of quantifying the blood flow more accurately to know whether there is a residual blood flow, and then we can actually attempt a surgical intervention. And the next in the future is going to be the endovascular surgery or endovascular canalization. This is a video of the Japanese team of Yamane et al., in which you can see that they did cannulization of the central retinal artery and perfused it with fluid as well as TPA. And they were pretty successful in this case. Okay, so in the end, I would like to say that yes, we should attempt it in cases where our routine methods don't work. Vitrectomy does help. It has helped restoring vision in 2 of my patients, one-eyed patients, one of even Somil's one-eyed patient. It has saved the career of an anesthetist who got 20/20 vision. It has helped a driver to retain a job and many more. So we should not let the eyes just go off. It's always better to try something. Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Nishikant. This was a very nice presentation, and our topic was about occlusion, so I think it was very relevant. If there is some time, I'll show some clinical slides. What do you say, Swapnesh?
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. This was actually one of the presentations which I had given at the BOA only, and often the residents cannot attend all the lectures. So, I was last May in Spain, and these are some of the pictures which I have put from Spain. And this year, what has happened to Spain, you have seen. And these are all from the Alhambra. Yeah, so one thing in, again, occlusal diseases which was not covered today was the Eales disease. And here I wanted to show you that these are certain clinical signs which you can see over here. Here you can see what is called as a border vessel. And here you can see the interhemispheric shunts which are forming between the superior and the inferior hemisphere due to the occlusion, venous occlusions which occur in periphlebitis. Then there is proliferation, of course, and there is hemorrhage, pre-retinal hemorrhage, new vessels, traction. Then the C fans, which you can see very typically. Here you can see another type of thing which is called as a rope ladder vessels. You know, they are between 2 bordering vessels. You can see the shunts which have formed, and here there is a gross non-perfusion. Again, here you can see the rope ladder between the 2 adjacent veins, and here you can see the non-perfusion. This is the laser treatment done for the proliferative Eales with vitreous hemorrhage. The results of the laser treatment are very good if done properly. Central Eales or papillophlebitis. Then retinal macroaneurysm is another thing which has telangiectasia. And here you can see that there is a macroaneurysm. Very often they present either with lot of exudation or after having bled. Sometimes they get a large hemorrhage and then they present. If you notice in the macroaneurysm, it is not the macroaneurysm itself which leaks too much. It is the surrounding telangiectatic vessels which are surrounding this macroaneurysm, and they are the ones which leak. You can see on the angiography. So our laser is targeted at this Irma-like thing which is going on around the aneurysm. One need not try to hit too hard with laser on the aneurysm. And here you can see these telangiectatic vessels which are in the vicinity of the macroaneurysm. Here is a Diwali light bulb sign. You can see this shines like a Diwali light bulb. Here is the laser treatment which has been done, and pre-laser and post-laser. Here you can see I have not done much laser on the aneurysm, but more on the surrounding areas, which are the telangiectatic vessels which are leaking. This is the result after the laser treatment. These are some more aneurysms which were present. Now another thing which is not recognized easily is a venous macroaneurysm, which happens with BRVOs. And here you can see this venous macroaneurysm. On the angiography, you will see it more clearly. Here you can see it. So all this telangiectasia which is leaking and causing exudation. And you can see like this just stumps like a dead tree. And this is after having done laser. Leber's or Coats disease was discussed by Sarita. Here is a case of Leber's with severe exudation, and you can see these Diwali light bulbs. You can see these small miliary aneurysms, what are called. These are lasered and the telangiectasia is treated. This also gives a very gratifying result post-laser. And this is, unfortunately, the person's central vision was disturbed because of the plaque which had formed. Now in perifoveal telangiectasia, although today this has been discussed, the type 1 which we were saying, and that has also been discussed, so I don't need to talk more about this. But there was some still more doubts in some people's minds about the differentiation between this and diabetic maculopathy. Here you can see all the signs very clearly. And yes, the FFA is a more definitive way of diagnosing, but a good clinical examination, which I feel with a contact lens on the slit lamp by biomicroscopy and an OCT suffices with good clinical acumen. So this is the, very often they are mistaken as SRNBMs and treated very hard. Laser is given, but nowadays people have reduced the amount of laser being done. But I have done laser for these patients, and some of them are 20-25 years ongoing. They have retained good vision and not gone into SRNBM. There is a study going on in Australia, and they have found out some genetic causes for it. Now the group 3 idiopathic perifoveal telangiectasia, which is very similar to diabetic maculopathy, and here you can see this is macular ischemia is the main thing which is there. And in 3B, you also have central nervous signs. So this is the group 3A. Now, telangiectasia due to a macular BRVO is very often mistaken as an idiopathic perifoveal telangiectasia. Here you can see that there has been a small macular BRVO, and the other features which are usually typically of IPT, which is on the temporal margin, then those right angle venules, the shining dots, all those things are missing in this case. And when you do an FFA, you can definitely find out the BRVO. So these are some of the memories of Spain which I had been to last year. And this particular Las Meninas is a very interesting thing. Here you have the full life of that time in Spain depicted. Here there is a dwarf, there is a dog, and this is the king looking through, and he has shown a mirror. In the mirror, he has shown the king and queen. And here you can see the little princess and all her handmaidens. So this particular picture is one of the most famous, and I say it's like you have got direct ophthalmoscopy, indirect ophthalmoscopy, slit lamp microscopy, everything has come in this picture. And when you see it, actually it gives you a very nice impression when you stand in front of it and see it. Anyway, with this eagle's eye, I think we should train our eyes to do slit lamp biomicroscopy with a contact lens, not a 90D lens. Mind you, now everything is going to change. People don't want to put a contact lens because of the COVID and all. But I think that it's far superior to a 90D lens. You can do, I was mentioning about the pulsations and all, which cattle trucking, somebody had asked about that. If you change the pressure on your lens, you can induce sluggish circulation to be manifested. And it is something similar to what ophthalmodynamometry, which is not being done today. But as students, 30 years ago, we used to do it in KEM. And there was an ophthalmodynamometer. So I think sometimes you should try it out. If you do have it in your teaching institutions, it will give you something nice to see. Okay, so with this, let's search for the Holy Grail, which has not yet been found. But till then, our clinical examination is the Rock of Gibraltar. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the presentation. Thank you, Dr. Borse. One question, Dr. Borse, is there?
Yes, what is it?
Sir, what would be the clinical as well as systemic signs in the patients who have presented within first 3 days or 4 days of CRAO, which can give a judgment whether this patient may have a good result? Are there any? Because he has got.
So if you see that the vision is very bad, like, not just about perception of light or something, then you know that it's already damaged. Most of the residual patients have about, say, better than hand movements or counting fingers vision for them to improve further. That is one sign that you can definitely see. And second is how pale your disc appears. And the deeper is the thrombus, your disc starts appearing pale right from within 12 hours onwards. And that might be giving a clue as to whether this patient is going to improve or not. And third is the lot of systemic factors that the patient might be having. So if the patient has got a lot of compromised cardiac function or, uncontrolled diabetes, etc., then you know that again, this patient may not do well.
So were you always able to pick up some kind of a fibrous material, which one of the talks you had mentioned at the disc head, optic nerve head? If we are able to tug out that fibrous part during vitrectomy.
Yeah, so that was my first experience, and I had tried to find out whether there is an abnormal tissue there, and that was definitely seen in my first 1 or 2 cases. But as I went ahead with the surgery, I found that it is not universally present. The only thing that I could find universally present is an absence of posterior vitreous detachment in each and every patient of central retinal artery occlusion till today.
So, sir, you could induce PVD easily in these patients then?
Yeah, that is the most tricky part of this surgery, because when you're having a hypotonous eye, you have to really be very gentle and slow. You can get a globe collapse, but you have to go through that.
But sir, in with such low IOP, the corneal folds, how is the view? I mean, the fine work that you're doing here.
There is no corneal fold, at all.
No, okay. I was just thinking with 8,
Yeah, so if you have to basically use a non-contact visualization system, because it's a contact, definitely cornea is going to fold up. Secondly, if you have a system like a Constellation and all, it will keep on maintaining your pressure at around 8, and that will help you. That does help.
Okay. Good. Thank you, sir. That is the surgeries were a visual treat, sir. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Any more questions?
Yeah, one question is being I'm answering on the chat here. Okay. So I'll speak. Speak. The right-angled vessels, why do they look right-angled? Because they appear to dip into the deeper retina, and that is why they look right angle. Because of some of the obstructions, there are obstructed small capillaries, and so they appear to dip inside. That is why they give a right angled appearance. Okay, somebody had asked that.
Yeah, there are some people who now feel that this might be basically a Mueller cell deformity, and that also causes a Mueller cell atrophy first, and that causes the dipping in parafoveal telangiectasia.
Yes.
We have answered all the questions, sir, I suppose.
With permission of the seniors, should we end the session? And thank you, Sarita, for a wonderful and a very detailed presentation. And thank you, Dr. Hemang sir and Bose sir, for adding to the topic. I'm sure the PGs will benefit from it. And these videos will always remain in the memory of BOA because it will go on the YouTube channel. And also your Spain photos, sir, they will always be etched in the memory.
Okay. Anyway, thank you very much. It was a nice, it was a pleasure interacting with everybody, and God bless you all. And take care.
Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you, Swapnish, and thank you, Sumit.
Rita, we had an attendance of 55 to 60. You were anxious at the start.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you,
for
Sarita.
joining in.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot,
Thanks,
sir.
Swapnish. Bye. Thanks, Sumit.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night.
Good night. Good night.